The Xbox Series X and PS5 are just on the horizon, and I can't help but feel like in some ways, history is repeating itself. So I want to take a look back in the past, back at the 6th generation of systems, and I invited a couple other creators to weigh in with their thoughts as well on Xbox versus PS2. Much like how the original PlayStation was the result of Sony having a falling out of a working relationship with Nintendo when they were originally going to make an actual disc-based Nintendo system, the Nintendo PlayStation, Xbox was made as a result of Microsoft failing to make an agreement with Sony. Now, it's not the exact same situation as Sony and Nintendo. That was something where they were actually working together on a system, and then very much to Sony's surprise, Nintendo changed its mind.
It's the new Nintendo 64. So what's the big deal, and why is Toys R Us already sold out?
Toys R Us store sold out in 15 minutes, but the store model is attracting Nintendo fans like crazy.
Whereas in the case of Microsoft and Sony, Bill Gates went to the CEO of Sony at the time, Nobuyuki Ide, and brought up the idea of them working with Sony on the PlayStation 2. This is similar to a deal they had already done with the Dreamcast, for instance, and Sony refused.
Man, stay off the light speed!
My bad.
Sonic Adventure on Sega Dreamcast.
60 frames a second. Sonic will have to run pretty fast to catch Nintendo and Sony.
Most gamers think about the idea of console wars. They typically imagine the stuff that went down in the 90s with Nintendo clashing against Sega. But in my mind, what was a much more interesting battle was definitely the stuff that happened in the 6th generation with Sony trying to dominate the market. I mean, when the PlayStation 2 came out, they were taking on Master Chief.
And with the early launch games like Halo, Microsoft had made a statement that, they were a force to be reckoned with. This wasn't just another, Microsoft experiment that was just going to fail in a couple of years. You could tell that they had done a lot of research and their homework on game systems and game consoles. But for me, I think the biggest thing about Xbox was their partnership with Sega, and that was really what did it for me as my favorite system and something that I preferred over the PlayStation 2 at the time.
They were trying to crush the remnants of the Sega Dreamcast, which was still mildly popular at the time, and they managed to actually do it.
Sony's refusal to work with Microsoft led to the creation of the Xbox. Because at the time, there was a lot of uncertainty about what the future of home gaming consoles was going to look like, especially in comparison to the home PC market. There was a very real belief that consoles were going to start to become more and more like true multimedia devices and possibly overtake and replace interest in home PCs. Obviously, where we stand now, that isn't what happened, but that is a very real fear at the time that informed the decision for Microsoft to want to get in on the home console market and go head-to-head with Sony.
Let's kick some tail!
Let me now unveil Xbox. Well, I would think that...
It doesn't matter what you think, Bill.
I really want to focus on how this relationship started and what ended up happening as far as the competition between these two systems. Which one sold better, and by how much, which is a very large margin if you know anything about the history of these systems, and why that happened.
I mean, it would have been nice to have won, but hey, you win some, you lose some, right?
Well, I don't know much about all that, but as long as you can fit into that chicken suit, the job is yours.
Now, the Xbox and PlayStation 2 were part of the 6th generation of gaming systems, which also included the Nintendo GameCube and the Sega Dreamcast, and out of those systems, the original Xbox did sell the second most number of systems. At the time of the Xbox 360's release, which you could consider kind of the beginning of the end of the 6th generation of systems, the original Xbox sold 24 million units, which is not terrible. It beat out both the Nintendo GameCube and Dreamcast. However, it does pale in comparison to the massive success, which was the PS2, where at that same time, the PS2 had sold 90 million consoles. What's really interesting about this difference in sales is the fact that for its generation, the PS2 was actually the weakest of them, especially when compared to the Xbox, which had a CPU that was over twice as fast and a GPU roughly 3 times as powerful. Now, part of this was because the Xbox did come out later, it was a full year after the PS2, and because it was being made as a sort of answer to other systems and it was Xbox's first console, they really wanted to push having a high-power system.
박수 PlayStation!
And that's just at the end of 2005. The PS2 continued to be the main console for Sony for another year, and it also continued to sell well worldwide even past that when the PS3 was released, eventually climbing its way to a current total of around 157 million systems, which not only very heavily outsells all the consoles of its time, but continues to hold the place of the top-selling gaming system ever. Now, there are a lot of reasons why PS2 sold that well. There's many factors, including the timing of its release, the price it had relative to its competitors, and more than anything, of course, the thing I always argue for,
humongous catalog of games.
The game library.
What's up guys, it's your girl Lady Pelvic, and what makes the PlayStation 2 era so amazing is its huge library, specifically of JRPGs. Also, the PlayStation 2 was gifted to me from my grandmother for graduating elementary school. The PlayStation 2 was littered with JRPGs. We have Final Fantasy X, X-2, Arc the Lag, Persona 4, Dragon Quest VIII, Xenosaga, Suikoden 5, some Grandia, some Disgaea, obviously Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, which was a huge standout for me, and not a JRPG,
the Tekken franchise, Devil May Cry.
They flooded the market with top-notch RPGs, things like Grandia, Final Fantasy, and of course, really weird gems like Dot Hack.
Dot Hack, the trilogy, and the quadrilogy. The original 4, y'all know what I'm trying to say. I love all of them. I'm a huge Dot Hack fangirl, and I remember coming home from school and I would just spend hours upon hours in this game.
And now, even as I look back, the PlayStation 2 definitely won the 6th generation in my opinion, because they managed to just give us the games and experiences we really wanted.
So while the original Xbox didn't have quite the same library that the PS2 had, and fell behind in a couple other specific areas, as far as just raw power went, it was much stronger. And in the case of what few games were released multi-platform at that time, they did look better and run smoother on the Xbox. Something else that made the Xbox very special compared to its competition is that it was one of the first systems that really started to actively try and bridge the gap between PCs and home game consoles. And one of the ways it did that is that this was the first major system to include a hard drive. Now, the PS2 did have a hard drive add-on that you could buy later down the line. Until then, you relied purely on memory cards, which you just slotted in. They were 8 megabytes in size as far as the official ones went, whereas the Xbox came with a built-in 8 gigabyte hard drive. It did also have a memory card option that you could slot into the controller, very similar to how the Dreamcast handled VMUs. However, it was a little more restrictive, and there were many games that didn't actually let you copy directly to those memory cards. They instead preferred that you kept stuff on the hard drive as much as possible. One specific area, though, when it comes to games that I think Microsoft ended up having a very large leg up on, and really was, again, one of the very foundational things that they built up upon in the 360 that was a huge success, was online gaming. Online gaming was not exclusive to Xbox. PlayStation 2 also opened up online gaming as well, but there were more titles in the Xbox camp that really built around that concept, and it was something they focused a lot more on. They had their Xbox Live service, which did require a monthly fee, which we still have today.
That was something that I really got very interested in, and lots of us did, having those early Xbox Live moments in history where you were playing games like Project Gotham Racing. I mean, for me, the Xbox represented everything that I wanted in a game system at the time. Now, the PlayStation 2 could do all that, but you had to kind of piecemeal all these parts together to get your system online. And for me, the Xbox essentially just represented everything that I wanted in a game console in one box that I could just plug in and play. And I think for me, that was probably the most compelling thing about the system.
But it allowed people to make use of things like having a gamer tag and a friends list, whereas PlayStation was focused more on game-to-game online situations. They supported online gaming, but everything was handled on a game-by-game basis. The games had their own dedicated servers made by the game's dev company, and so it wasn't something that carried over across multiple titles. This was actually a really important foundational thing for the original Xbox in terms of getting Microsoft an in to the home console market. Something that was really cool about this is that because because the Xbox was more similar to a PC, there were game devs that were traditionally associated with just PC games that were more willing to make their introduction to the home console market with Xbox over its competitors. Really good examples of this include Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind from Bethesda, coming out on the Xbox and no other consoles, and of course BioWare's Knights of the Old Republic, which was an Xbox exclusive as far as consoles go. This also went on to be true for Obsidian's direct sequel Knights of the Old Republic 2 and BioWare's other major release, Jade Empire.
Now, even before the Xbox was released, I was following its progress and its stories in news articles and in magazines. The system was something that really was something I was very interested in over the PlayStation 2. And that's because I came from the world of PC games. As a PC gamer, I felt like that the Xbox essentially took a Windows machine and packaged it up into a console and it allowed you to play in the living room.
While we're on the subject of hardware, while the PlayStation 2 was weaker than the Xbox, there is another area that it, however, did excel a lot further at, and that's the controller. A lot of this comes down to how quickly the Xbox was made and some problems that ended up happening behind the scenes as far as getting it ready as a new system. Primarily the fact that the PlayStation already kind of laid the groundwork with their PlayStation DualShock design, which they made for the PS1, and they really just kind of lightly refined for the PS2. It was a familiar control style that people really liked. The dual analog sticks were still a major revelation for a lot of gamers in a lot of ways that games were designed, and so it was a very comfortable option for people to use. Xbox, on the other hand, introduced what is now known as the Duke, a very, very large and honestly not very comfortable controller unless you happen to have large enough hands to where it actually ended up working out that way. Now, the reason for the original Xbox's gigantic controller design is because amid all the rush of getting ready to go against PlayStation, they had already made the circuit boards for the controllers before actually designing what the controller was going to look like. It ended up having to be kind of engineered in reverse and resulted in, well, you had this giant circuit board to work with, so now the controllers end up being massive. This wasn't permanently the case for the original Xbox. When the system made its release later on in Japan, they made a smaller controller called the Xbox Controller S, which is a naming scheme they have kept up with ever since with systems like the Xbox One S. And eventually, that controller did make its way to the American markets as well because people saw that design in Japan and went, why can't we have smaller controllers? While the Duke has a certain nostalgic love these days, back at the time, it was definitely something that a lot of people absolutely hated. There were some people who did actually find it more comfortable because their hand size was larger, but for the majority of people, it was just an unwieldy, gigantic thing that made it difficult even to reach the sticks for some people, especially if you were a kid playing games. The other big problem for Microsoft on this is that while $300 was a competitive price point at the time, it was also being sold at a very heavy loss. Part of how Microsoft was able to get the original Xbox out as quickly as they did is that they relied on off-the-shelf parts. They didn't have anything specially designed for the Xbox originally. Instead, it was all pre-existing PC parts, which is part of the whole story of how the original Xbox is, again, very similar to a PC, at least more so than any other console at the time. But because they were relying on off-the-shelf parts, it was considerably more expensive to produce these systems because they're all buying stuff aftermarket, which resulted in it costing them $425 to build an Xbox while they're meanwhile selling it at $300. Now, selling at a loss is not an unoriginal thing for game consoles. It is actually pretty common because the hope is you're going to sell enough accessories, enough games, and nowadays enough special services that, you're going to make your profit back. That didn't happen. In fact, while the original Xbox was a relative success, being the second most selling console on the market and being their first system, they did end up losing roughly $4 billion as a result of it. So while PlayStation 2 was the weaker of the two systems, it did have the better price point, it had the timing of coming out first, and of course, the most important thing, it had the game library, thanks to the fact that it was an established console after the PS1. When you look at the relative two libraries of these systems, there is just absolutely no competition. This isn't to say that there weren't great games on the Xbox, it's just that when you look at the number of titles between them, there's just a lot more going on for PlayStation. Xbox had a pretty decent start by having games like the original Halo come out, they had Dead or Alive 3, they had Project Gotham Racing, which eventually got replaced by the Forza series nowadays.
Crazy Taxi 3, High Roller, as well as House of the Dead 3, Jet Set Radio Future, Gun Valkyrie. They had so many awesome exclusive games that came out only for the Xbox that you couldn't find anywhere else. And for me, those exclusive games is something that really just kind of set the Xbox apart. Not only that, it was obviously a lot more powerful than the PlayStation 2. So you had this performance that you knew that there was just this unrivaled, ability to display and run games at these 720p HD resolutions with 5.1 sound.
While Xbox had the power, PlayStation held all the cards when it came to things like first-party studios and third-party support. Because while, again, Xbox got some support from companies that were traditionally more associated with PC, third-party companies that made console games were more focused on PlayStation. Capcom, Konami, Square, and many others were all making games that ended up staying as true exclusives to the PlayStation. So they not only had the power of great games made by first-party studios like Sly Cooper, Ratchet & Clank, God of War, but they also had lots of third-party games that stayed exclusive to PS2. Something that I think is worth noting, though, and is really interesting, is that there were some third-party companies that were initially only working with Sony, but opened up to Xbox after they saw how well its first year was doing. Some really key examples of this are Rockstar with the Grand Theft Auto games. Those were initially true PlayStation exclusives, but ended up getting ported to the Xbox later on. And this also happened with Konami, who ended up porting some games like Silent Hill 2 to the Xbox, and even brought over Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 with redone titles and added content in the form of Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance and Solid 3 Subsistence. When I look back at the 6th generation of gaming, especially in respect to these two companies, I think the really big takeaway is that PlayStation 2 absolutely dominated, and for good reason. But it was a position where Sony got very comfortable, and it was a time where Xbox started really pushing things in a different direction than a lot of other consoles were, and started the groundwork for ended up being a major success with the Xbox 360. Sure, there are certain things that are different with the current generation. Online gaming is way more important, as well as how the consoles handle things like social networking through them. There are way more multi-platform titles around both systems, but ultimately, a lot of the things that mattered back then are still a large part of the conversation. Timing, pricing, exclusive titles, even if it's not the entire library anymore, but just a few select ones, those are still the big things that really drive a lot of the conversation. And so when we look at these next generation consoles, these are some really big, important questions we still need to have answered. Sure, we know the specs for each one, but as history has shown, that isn't the only thing that matters. It's the experiences and games they bring us over the next couple years that will cement their place in history. And thanks to MVG, Pelvic Gaming, and Dreamcast Guy all for showing up in today's video. Make sure to check their channels out. I have them all linked down below in the description.